There is a sentence that was published online in November of 2011. 7 years before anything happened. 7 years before the phone call. 7 years before the kitchen. 7 years before the husband stopped breathing on a cold tile floor in Portland, Oregon. The sentence was the title of an essay. The essay was 1,300 words long. The title was 5 words long. How to Kill Your Husband. I am Miles Ghost Hunter, and tonight I want you to sit with me in that courtroom in Multnomah County, Oregon. I want you to sit with me in the kitchen at the Oregon Culinary Institute at 6:55 in the morning on June 2nd, 2018. I want you to sit with me as a woman named Nancy Crampton Brophy takes the stand in her own defense and tells 12 jurors that the essay was just research, that the browser searches were just research, that the ghost gun parts she purchased online were just research, that the silver minivan on the security camera was just a coincidence, that the $1.4 million in life insurance was just a coincidence, that everything was just a coincidence. And I want you to decide for yourself whether you believe her. Because 12 strangers did, and they did not. Lock the door, unplug the phone, tell the children to go to bed. Because what we are about to walk through is not fiction. It was written by a woman who wrote fiction for a living, and then it stopped being fiction. Let me tell you about the man who died first, because before this was a story about a killer, it was a story about a husband. His name was Daniel Brophy. He was 63 years old. He was a chef. He was not a famous chef. He was not a television chef. He was the kind of chef that other chefs remember forever. He was an instructor at the Oregon Culinary Institute in the Pearl District of Portland. He taught young people how to hold a knife. He taught young people how to break down a chicken. He taught young people how to stand on their feet for 12 hours in a hot kitchen without losing their mind. He had been teaching for 28 years. He had trained more than 1,000 cooks. He was the kind of teacher whose students came back 10 years later, 15 years later, 20 years later, and hugged him in the middle of a grocery store. Daniel was tall. He had a gray beard. He had soft eyes. He rode his bicycle to work every single morning, in the rain, in the cold, in the summer. He left his house before the sun came up. He was always the first one in the kitchen. He unlocked the doors at 7. He had the ovens warming by 7:15. He had the coffee made by 7:20. The students arrived at 7:30, every morning, for 28 years. He had a wife. Her name was Nancy. They had been married for 27 years. They lived in a small house in the Beaverton area, just outside Portland. They had a £50 mortgage on that house, and they were behind on it. They had credit card debt. They had a second mortgage. They had 3 separate life insurance policies on Daniel. Together, those policies were worth $1.4 million. Nancy was the sole beneficiary on all 3, but from the outside, this was a normal marriage. Daniel cooked, Nancy wrote. Nancy wrote romance novels, self-published romance novels, books with titles like The Wrong Husband, The Wrong Cop, Hell on the Heart. Nancy was 68 years old. She had gray blonde hair that she wore cut short. She wore reading glasses on a beaded chain around her neck. She looked like someone's grandmother. She looked like the kind of woman who would bring you banana bread if you moved in next door. She was not. I want you to remember Daniel, because in a few minutes we are going to walk into the kitchen where he died, and I want you to know who he was before he became a body on a floor. He was a man who taught people how to feed other people. He was a man who rode a bicycle through the rain. He was a man whose students loved him. His last text message, sent the night before he died, was to one of his former students. The message said, "Proud of you, kid. Keep going." That was the last thing Daniel Brophy wrote to another human being on Earth. The morning of June 2nd, 2018 was a Saturday. It was overcast in Portland. It was 54 degrees. Daniel got on his bicycle at 6:20 in the morning. He rode from the house in Beaverton to the Oregon Culinary Institute in the Pearl District. That ride takes about 30 minutes. He arrived at the back of the building at 6:50. He parked his bicycle in the rack. He unlocked the back door. He walked into the kitchen. He turned on the lights. He started the ovens. He started the coffee. He was alone. At 7:15, the first student arrived. Her name was Kate. She came in through the front. She walked past the reception desk. She walked down the hallway toward the teaching kitchen. The door to the kitchen was propped open. The lights were on. The ovens were warm. The coffee was made. But she did not hear Daniel. Daniel always called out hello. Daniel always said good morning. Daniel always made some joke about how early it was. She walked into the kitchen, and she saw him. He was on the floor. He was on his back. He was between the prep station and the stove, and he was not moving. She screamed. Within 10 minutes, there were 6 police cars outside the Oregon Culinary Institute. Within 20 minutes, the forensics team was inside. Within an hour, the building was sealed. By noon, every student and every instructor at the school had been interviewed. By the end of the day, detectives had a preliminary timeline. Daniel had died somewhere between 6:50 and 7:10 in the morning. He had died very quickly. There were no signs of a struggle. There were no signs of forced entry. There was no weapon left at the scene. There was nothing missing from his pockets. His wallet was still there. His phone was still there. His wedding ring was still on his finger. The first theory was robbery. It was the obvious theory. A kitchen in the early morning, an older man alone, a back door unlocked. Maybe someone followed him in. Maybe someone was waiting. Maybe it was a random street encounter that went wrong. Portland had seen an uptick in property crime that year. Detectives started canvassing the neighborhood. They knocked on doors. They pulled footage from every business on that block. And within 48 hours, that theory collapsed. Nothing had been taken. Daniel still had his wallet. He still had his phone. He still had his bicycle. The register in the culinary school's front office had not been touched. The computers had not been touched. The knives in the kitchen had not been touched. Nothing was missing. Nothing had been disturbed. Whoever walked into that kitchen at 7 in the morning came for one reason. They came for Daniel, and they left as quietly as they came. So the detectives started again. This time they did not look outward. This time they looked inward. Who was Daniel Brophy? Who loved him? Who hated him? Who benefited from his death? And the first name on that list, as it is on every list, was his wife. Detectives drove to the house in Beaverton around 11 in the morning on June 2nd. They had not yet made the death notification. They wanted to see her reaction when they told her. They rang the doorbell. Nancy Crampton Brophy opened the door. She was dressed. She had done her hair. She was wearing makeup. She had been up for hours. The detectives asked if they could come inside. Nancy said yes. They sat in the living room. The detective said, "Ma'am, we have some difficult news about your husband." And Nancy said, "Oh no, what happened?" Her voice was calm. Her hands did not shake. She did not sit down. She did not grab the arm of the couch. She just stood there and said, "Oh no." The detective told her Daniel was dead. Nancy cried. She cried for about 30 seconds. Then she stopped. She asked, "How did he die?" The detective said they could not share details yet, but it was not natural causes. Nancy nodded. She said, "I see." She asked, "When can I see him?" The detective said she could not see him yet. Nancy nodded again. She said, "I need to make some calls." And she walked into the kitchen and she made calls. She called her lawyer before she called her family. The detective on the scene, a veteran named Darren Posey, wrote in his notes that evening, quote, "Wife's demeanor inconsistent with notification, controlled, asked procedural questions, made attorney contact before family contact," end quote. That was the first flag. The second flag came from the security footage. The Oregon Culinary Institute did not have cameras inside the kitchen. but it had cameras on the outside of the building. And the building next door had cameras. And the building across the street had cameras. And the parking garage on the corner had cameras. By the afternoon of June 3rd, detectives had assembled a composite of every vehicle that had passed the Culinary Institute between 6 and 7:30 in the morning on June 2nd. One vehicle stood out. A silver Toyota minivan, year model approximately 2014. The minivan drove past the Culinary Institute at 6:42 in the morning. It circled the block. It drove past again at 6:48. It parked on a side street at 6:51. At 7:02, a figure got out of the minivan. The figure walked toward the back of the Culinary Institute. The figure wore dark clothing and a hooded sweatshirt. The figure was carrying something. At 7:09, the figure walked back to the minivan. The figure was moving quickly but not running. The figure got into the minivan. The minivan pulled away at 7:10. It drove west. It drove in the direction of Beaverton. Detectives ran the partial plate. The plate came back to a silver Toyota minivan registered to Nancy Crampton Brophy of Beaverton, Oregon, wife of the deceased. That was the second flag. It was a large flag. On June 5th, 3 days after Daniel's death, detectives drove back to the house in Beaverton. They asked Nancy if she would come down to the station and answer some questions. Nancy said yes. She brought her lawyer. The interview lasted 4 hours. Nancy was calm. Nancy was articulate. Nancy remembered everything, except for the things she did not remember. Detective Posey asked Nancy where she was on the morning of June 2nd. Nancy said she was at home. She said she slept in. She said she got up around 8. She said she made coffee. She said she was writing. She said she did not leave the house until the detectives arrived at 11. Detective Posey asked Nancy if anyone could confirm that. Nancy said no. Daniel was the only other person in the house, and Daniel was not home. Detective Posey asked Nancy about her vehicle. He asked her if she owned a silver Toyota minivan. Nancy said yes. Detective Posey asked when she had last driven it. Nancy said, "I drive it every day, but not on Saturday. On Saturday I was home." Detective Posey asked if he could see the minivan. Nancy said yes. They went outside. The minivan was in the driveway. The hood was cold. It had not been driven recently, according to Nancy. Detective Posey asked if he could look inside. Nancy's lawyer said no, not without a warrant. That was interview 1. Detective Posey let her go. He did not yet have enough to hold her, but he knew. Every detective I have ever talked to says the same thing. They know. Before the evidence comes in, before the search warrants come back, before the lab results, they know. Posey knew when he left that station that afternoon that the woman with the beaded eyeglass chain had killed her husband. He just had to prove it. The third flag came from the financial records. Detectives subpoenaed the bank accounts. They subpoenaed the credit card statements. They subpoenaed the insurance policies. And what they found was a woman who was drowning. Nancy and Daniel Brophy were 7 months behind on their mortgage. They were carrying $60,000 in credit card debt at an average interest rate of 22%. They had a second mortgage against the house for $90,000. Nancy's self-published romance novels were earning her, on average, $400 a month. Daniel's teaching salary was keeping the lights on, barely. And then there was the insurance. 3 policies, taken out at 3 different times. The first policy was from 1993. That one was modest, $200,000, a normal policy for a married couple. The second policy was from 2015, $500,000. Nancy increased the coverage 3 years before Daniel died. The third policy was from January of 2018, 5 months before Daniel died, $700,000. Total payout across all 3 policies if Daniel died, $1.4 million. Sole beneficiary. Nancy Crampton Brophy. Detective Posey looked at the January 2018 policy. He looked at the date, January 10th. He wrote in his notes that night, quote, "Wife takes out $700,000 policy on husband's life in January. Husband dies in June." End quote. That was the third flag. The flag was now enormous. But it was not enough. Insurance is not a confession. Financial pressure is not a confession. A silver minivan on a security camera is not a confession. Not yet. Not without the driver. Detective Posey needed one more thing. He needed the thing he did not yet know existed. He needed the essay. It was a junior detective who found it, a woman named Elena Rodriguez. She was 29 years old. She had been a detective for 2 years. She was assigned to dig through Nancy's online presence. Nancy had an author page on a blog platform called C. Jane Publish. Nancy had posted essays there for years. Essays about writing, essays about publishing, essays about marketing self-published romance novels. There were dozens of them. Rodriguez started reading. She found the essay on the afternoon of June 7th. The essay was posted November 4th, 2011. The title was "How to Kill Your Husband." Rodriguez read it twice, then she printed it. Then she walked into Detective Posey's office. Then she laid the printout on his desk, and she said, "Sir, you need to read this." The essay was 1,347 words. It was written in the first person. It began with the sentence, quote, "As a romantic suspense writer, I spend a lot of time thinking about murder." End quote. It went on to discuss in detail the various ways a wife might kill her husband. It discussed poison. It discussed staging an accident. It discussed shooting. It rated each method on 2 criteria. 1, how likely you were to get caught. 2, how much guilt you would feel afterward. The essay discussed motives, money, insurance, freedom, a new life. The essay discussed witnesses. The essay discussed how to behave when the police arrived. The essay discussed how to grieve convincingly. The essay ended with this sentence, quote, "After all, if the murder is supposed to set me free, I certainly don't want to spend any time in jail." End quote. Detective Posey read the essay. Then he read it again. Then he called the district attorney. On September 5th, 2018, 3 months after Daniel Brophy died, Nancy Crampton Brophy was arrested at her home in Beaverton. She was wearing the same beaded eyeglass chain. She was wearing slippers. She asked the arresting officers if she could put on shoes. They let her put on shoes. She was charged with murder and unlawful use of a firearm. She was held without bail. The case was assigned to a judge named Christopher Ramrus. The prosecutor was a man named Sean Overstreet. Nancy hired a defense attorney named Lisa Maxfield. Maxfield was a veteran of Portland criminal defense. She had represented difficult clients. She had won difficult cases. She looked at the evidence against Nancy and she saw one thing clearly. She had to keep the essay out of the trial. Maxfield filed a motion. She argued that the essay was prejudicial. She argued that it was not a confession. She argued that it was a piece of writing by a working romance novelist whose entire genre dealt with murder, revenge, and domestic drama. She argued that if the jury heard the essay, they would convict Nancy for writing fiction, not for committing a crime. She argued that admitting the essay would set a dangerous precedent for every novelist, screenwriter, and artist in Oregon. The hearing on the motion was held in January of 2019. Judge Ramrus listened to both sides. He took the motion under advisement. He ruled 6 weeks later. The ruling was a partial victory for the defense. The essay itself could not be read to the jury. The jury could not see the title. The jury could not hear the specific passages. But Judge Ramrus ruled that the prosecution could refer to Nancy's body of work in general. They could reference the themes she wrote about. They could discuss her research habits. They could introduce her browser history, her purchases, and her general patterns as a writer whose craft involved studying violence. It was a narrow ruling, and it was a victory for Lisa Maxfield. But it was not enough. Because the prosecution had something else. Something they had been building for 18 months. Something that did not require the essay at all. Something that had been sitting in the evidence locker for 14 months. Something that would tell the jury, in Nancy's own digital footprint, exactly what she had been planning. The prosecution had her computer. When detectives seized Nancy's laptop in September of 2018, they sent it to the Oregon State Police Digital Forensics Lab in Salem. The lab was run by a man named Wesley Chin. Chin had been doing digital forensics for 14 years. He had seen everything. He had seen hard drives that had been submerged in bathtubs. He had seen phones that had been run over by cars. He had seen laptops that had been taken apart, piece by piece, and hidden in 3 different states. He said, on the record, that Nancy Crampton Brophy's laptop was one of the cleanest attempts at evidence destruction he had ever examined, and one of the least successful. Nancy had deleted her browser history. She had emptied her recycle bin. She had used a third-party program to overwrite free space on the hard drive. She had done, in her own mind, a thorough job. She was a romance novelist. She thought she understood how computers worked. She did not understand how computers worked. Wesley Chin recovered everything. Every search she had made in the 18 months before Daniel died, every page she had visited, every item she had placed in an online shopping cart, every PDF she had downloaded, every video she had watched, everything. The list was long, the list was specific, the list was chilling. Nancy had searched for, in order, over a period of 14 months, the following: how to find a hitman, the going rate for contract killings, how to shoot a gun accurately, how to disassemble a firearm, gun cleaning supplies, silencers legal in Oregon, ghost guns, how to build an untraceable firearm, block frame 80%, slide assembly, barrel kit. She had visited forums, she had read threads, she had taken screenshots, and she had purchased. On January of 2018, the same month she took out the $700,000 insurance policy, Nancy purchased a Glock 19 slide and barrel. Not a complete firearm, just the slide and the barrel. The parts of a Glock that are regulated, the parts that have serial numbers. She purchased them from a seller in Florida. She had them shipped to a post office box she had rented under a slight variation of her name. She paid in cash, by money order. No credit card trail, no digital receipt that connected to her main accounts. The frame, the 80% frame that would turn those parts into a functioning weapon, she ordered separately, from a different seller, in Nevada, also to a post office box, also paid in money order. 80% frames are legal to purchase without a background check in Oregon. They are legal because they are not, technically, firearms. They are blocks of polymer that have to be finished with a drill press before they become a working lower receiver. A person who assembles a gun this way creates what is called a ghost gun. It has no serial number. It is not registered. It cannot be traced. It does not exist in any government database. Nancy Crampton Brophy, a 68-year-old romance novelist with no prior interest in firearms, built a ghost gun in her home office in Beaverton, Oregon, in February of 2018. She bought the tools. She bought the instructional videos. She bought the cleaning supplies. She bought the ammunition. And 4 months later, her husband was dead, shot twice in the chest at point-blank range in a kitchen in Portland. The ghost gun was never recovered. Detectives searched the house. Detectives searched the minivan. Detectives searched the storage unit Nancy kept in Beaverton. Detectives searched every trash can, every dumpster, every body of water within a 20-mile radius of the Brophy home. They never found the weapon. To this day, the ghost gun that killed Daniel Brophy has never been recovered. But they found the receipts. They found the tutorials in her browser cache. They found the photograph, on her phone, taken on February 19th, of a completed Glock 19-style handgun sitting on a cutting mat on her kitchen counter. The photograph had GPS metadata. The metadata placed it inside her house at 2:17 in the afternoon. Nancy had taken a picture of the murder weapon 4 months before the murder, and she had not deleted it. The trial began on April 2nd, 2022. It had been delayed 3 times by the pandemic. Nancy had been held in the Multnomah County Detention Center for 3.5 years by the time she walked into that courtroom. She had lost 20 pounds. Her hair had gone completely white. She walked with a slight stoop. She looked to the jury like an elderly widow, which, technically, she was. The prosecutor, Sean Overstreet, opened his case with a quiet voice. He did not yell. He did not gesticulate. He walked the jury, slowly and methodically, through 7 years of Nancy Crampton Brophy's life. The essay referenced in general terms as the judge had ruled. The romance novels that dealt with murdered husbands, the mounting debt, the crumbling mortgage, the insurance policies taken out one on top of the other, the browser history, the ghost gun purchases, the photograph on her phone, the silver minivan on the security footage, the timeline, the back door of the Oregon Culinary Institute, the moment Daniel stepped into his kitchen, the 30 seconds it took for him to die, and the woman, wearing a hooded sweatshirt, walking calmly back to her minivan at 7:09 in the morning, driving west, driving home, arriving in Beaverton, making coffee, sitting down to write. The defense, led by Lisa Maxfield, did what defenses do when the evidence is overwhelming. She attacked the chain of logic. She attacked the motive. She pointed out that Nancy had no history of violence. She pointed out that the murder weapon had never been recovered. She pointed out that the forensic evidence placed Nancy's minivan near the scene, but not Nancy herself. She argued that the browser history proved nothing more than that Nancy was a writer who researched violence. She argued that many writers, from Stephen King to Gillian Flynn to Agatha Christie, had researched far more disturbing things without being accused of anything. She put Nancy on the stand. That was the mistake. Nancy testified for 2.5 days. She was calm, she was articulate, she was precise, and she contradicted herself over and over. She said she had never purchased gun parts. Then she said she had purchased them for research. She said she had never been to the Oregon Culinary Institute that morning. Then she said she had driven past it, in her minivan, to pick up something for breakfast. Then she said she could not remember exactly what she had done that morning. She said she loved Daniel. She said they had a happy marriage. She said the insurance policies were Daniel's idea. Daniel, who was not there to contradict her. Daniel, who had been dead for nearly 4 years. The prosecutor cross-examined her for 6 hours. He did not raise his voice once. He just asked her to explain. Explain the ghost gun. Explain the photograph. Explain the minivan. Explain the insurance. Explain the debt. Explain the deleted browser history. Explain the post office boxes. Explain the money orders. Explain why, on the morning her husband died, she had no alibi, no witnesses, and no memory of where she had been. By the 2nd day of her testimony, the jury was no longer looking at Nancy. They were looking at each other. The case went to the jury on May 23rd, 2022. The jury deliberated for 2 days. On May 25th, they returned a verdict. Guilty of murder in the 2nd degree. Guilty of unlawful use of a firearm. Nancy Crampton Brophy, at age 71, was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 25 years, which, at her age, meant life in prison, period. She is currently held at the Coffee Creek Correctional Facility in Wilsonville, Oregon. She will die there. She never confessed. She has never confessed. To this day, she maintains her innocence. Her appeals have been filed. Her appeals have been denied. The essay, How to Kill Your Husband, was taken down from the C. Jane Publish blog the day after her arrest. Archive copies still exist on the internet. You can find them if you look. I do not recommend you look. Daniel Brophy's students held a memorial service for him at the Oregon Culinary Institute on the 1st anniversary of his death. Over 400 people attended. Former students flew in from 9 different states and 3 different countries. They cooked a meal in his honor. They set a place at the table that nobody sat in. His bicycle, the one he had ridden to work every day for 20 years, was mounted on a wall in the main kitchen. It is still there. Students who never met him walk past it every morning. Their instructors tell them who he was. Nancy's royalties from her romance novels continued to accrue during her trial. After her conviction, her publishing accounts were frozen. The titles were pulled from most major retailers. A few remain available on obscure platforms. If you search her name, you can still find them. The covers show women in various states of distress. The titles are variations on deception, on betrayal, on husbands who are not who they seem. She wrote the genre she lived in. Or maybe she lived in the genre she wrote. It is not clear even now which came first. There is a sentence that was published online in November of 2011. It was the title of an essay. The title was 5 words long. How to Kill Your Husband. 7 years later, she did. And a jury decided, by a unanimous vote, that her fiction and her life had become the same story. I am Miles Ghost Hunter, and if you thought this one was dark, wait until you hear what I have for you next week. A small town in Louisiana, a sheriff with 3 ex-wives. 2 of them are dead, 1 of them is missing, and the coroner who signed the death certificates is his cousin. If you want to know what happens when a man with a badge decides he is also the judge, the jury, and the executioner, come back next Friday. Same channel, same time. Lock your doors. I will see you then.